Once the king of Harlem, Frank Lucas desperately seeks help. The betrayal that changed everything. The fall from grace. The morning sun filtered through the barred windows of the federal penitentiary, casting long shadows across the concrete floor of Frank Lucas's cell. It was a far cry from the penthouse suites and luxury cars that once defined his existence. The man who had once ruled Harlem's streets with an iron fist now sat on a metal bunk, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held a worn photograph. A snapshot of better days when he was untouchable, invincible, the undisputed king of the drug trade. Frank Lucas had built an empire from nothing. Born into poverty in North Carolina, he had clawed his way up through the ranks of organized crime, eventually establishing himself as one of the most powerful drug lords in New York City during the 1960s and 1970s. His operation was legendary, sophisticated, ruthless, and incredibly profitable. He had connections that stretched from the streets of Harlem to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where he personally sourced the purest heroin available. His product was so pure, so potent, that it became the gold standard in the drug market. But success in the criminal underworld came with a price that Frank had not fully anticipated. The higher he climbed, the more enemies he made. The more money he accumulated, the more people wanted a piece of his empire. And the more power he wielded, the more dangerous his position became. He had surrounded himself with people he thought were loyal, family members, childhood friends, business associates. But loyalty in the criminal world was a commodity as fleeting as the high that his product provided. The photograph in his hands showed him at the height of his power, dressed in an expensive suit, standing beside a Cadillac that cost more than most people's homes. His smile was confident, almost arrogant. He had believed himself untouchable, protected by his wealth, his connections, and his reputation for swift and brutal retribution against those who crossed him. He had believed that money could buy anything: loyalty, protection, even immortality. But money could not buy what he needed most: genuine friendship and trust. The investigation that would eventually bring Frank Lucas down had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly. Federal agents had been watching him for years, building their case methodically, gathering evidence, turning informants. What Frank did not know was that some of his closest associates were already cooperating with the authorities, providing detailed information about his operations in exchange for reduced sentences and witness protection. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and devastating. On January 13, 1975, federal agents raided his home and arrested him on drug trafficking charges. The empire that had taken years to build crumbled in a matter of hours. His assets were seized, his operations dismantled, his network destroyed. The man who had once commanded respect and fear now found himself facing decades in prison. Subscribe to our channel to follow Frank Lucas's incredible story of rise and fall. Click the bell icon to be notified when we release new chapters of this gripping narrative. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you the most compelling true crime stories. Years passed in the confines of federal prison. Frank Lucas had time, more time than he could have ever imagined, to reflect on his life, his choices, and the people he had trusted. The realization that struck him hardest was not the loss of his freedom or his wealth, but the understanding that nearly everyone around him had been motivated by self-interest rather than genuine care. His family had abandoned him. The friends who had celebrated his success and enjoyed the fruits of his criminal enterprise disappeared when he needed them most. The women who had been attracted to his money and power moved on to other wealthy men. Even some of his own family members had testified against him, providing evidence that helped secure his conviction. The betrayal was not just legal, it was deeply personal. In prison, Frank had nothing but time to think. He spent long hours in his cell, reading books, writing letters that would never be sent, and contemplating the trajectory of his life. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted: wealth beyond measure, power, respect, fear. Yet he had lost everything that truly mattered: his freedom, his dignity, and the genuine connections that make life worth living. The other inmates knew who he was. Some approached him with respect, others with curiosity, and a few with hostility. But Frank found that even in prison, genuine friendship was rare. Most interactions were transactional, based on what one person could do for another. He had money on the inside. Family members occasionally sent funds, but money in prison was a double-edged sword. It could buy protection and comfort, but it also made him a target. One of the most difficult realizations Frank came to was understanding how his own behavior had contributed to his isolation. He had built his empire through intimidation and violence. He had demanded loyalty through fear rather than earning it through respect and genuine care. He had treated people as tools to be used rather than as human beings worthy of dignity. The very methods that had made him successful in the criminal world had also ensured that when he fell, he would fall alone. The prison chaplain, Father Michael, was one of the few people who seemed to interact with Frank without ulterior motives. The priest would visit him regularly, not to judge him or to preach at him, but simply to listen. In these conversations, Frank began to open up about his regrets, his fears, and his desperate desire for redemption. He spoke about the people he had hurt, the families destroyed by his drug trade, the lives ruined by the heroin he had distributed so efficiently. "I was a king," Frank told Father Michael during one of their conversations, his voice hollow with regret. "But I ruled over nothing but suffering. I had everything, and I had nothing. I was surrounded by people, and I was completely alone." Father Michael listened without judgment, offering not absolution but understanding. He helped Frank see that redemption was possible, that it was never too late to change, to seek forgiveness, and to try to make amends for the damage he had caused. Leave a comment below telling us what you think about Frank's realization. Do you believe people can truly change? Share your thoughts and engage with our community. We read and respond to every comment, and your perspective matters to us. As Frank Lucas aged in prison, his health began to deteriorate. The years of stress, poor diet, and the harsh conditions of incarceration took their toll on his body. He developed heart problems, arthritis, and other age-related ailments. More importantly, his mental health suffered. He struggled with depression, anxiety, and the weight of his regrets. He desperately needed help, medical help, psychological help, and spiritual help, but he was not sure where to find it or how to ask for it. The prison system, while providing basic medical care, was not equipped to address the deeper psychological and spiritual needs that Frank was experiencing. He needed someone to talk to, someone who could help him process his trauma and his regrets. He needed guidance on how to live with the consequences of his actions and how to find meaning in his remaining years. Frank began writing letters to various organizations and individuals, seeking help. He reached out to religious organizations, rehabilitation centers, and advocacy groups that worked with incarcerated individuals. Some of his letters went unanswered. Others received polite but dismissive responses. The world had largely moved on from Frank Lucas. He was yesterday's news, a cautionary tale from a bygone era. But Frank did not give up. He continued to reach out, to ask for help, to seek connection with people who might understand his situation and his desperate need for redemption. He participated in prison programs designed to help inmates develop job skills and prepare for re-entry into society. He attended educational classes and earned his GED. He worked in the prison library, helping other inmates access books and information. Through these activities, Frank began to rebuild his sense of purpose. He realized that even in prison, he could make a positive impact on others. He could use his experience and his story as a cautionary tale to help younger inmates avoid the mistakes he had made. He could offer advice, support, and friendship to those who were struggling with their own demons. One of the most significant turning points in Frank's life came when he was approached by a documentary filmmaker who was interested in telling his story. The filmmaker, named Ridley Scott, saw in Frank's life a compelling narrative about ambition, power, corruption, and redemption. Frank was hesitant at first. He had spent years trying to stay out of the spotlight, but he eventually agreed to participate in the project. The process of telling his story, of reliving his past and examining his actions in detail, was painful but ultimately therapeutic. Frank found that by sharing his story, he could help others understand the dangers of the criminal lifestyle and the importance of making better choices. He could use his notoriety for good, to educate and to warn, rather than to glorify or to inspire. The documentary, which would eventually be released as American Gangster, brought Frank's story to a wider audience. While the film took some creative liberties with the facts, it captured the essence of Frank's rise and fall, and it introduced his story to millions of people around the world. More importantly, it gave Frank a platform to speak about his regrets and his desire for redemption. Like this video if you believe in the power of redemption and second chances. Your likes help us reach more people with stories that matter, stories that inspire change and understanding. Show your support by hitting that like button now. As Frank Lucas continued his journey toward redemption, he began to encounter people who were willing to help him, not because they wanted something from him, but because they believed in the possibility of change. These unexpected allies came from various walks of life: social workers, journalists, filmmakers, and ordinary people who had been moved by his story. One of the most important relationships Frank developed was with a social worker named Angela, who worked in the prison system helping inmates prepare for re-entry. Angela was different from many of the other professionals Frank had encountered. She did not judge him for his past. Instead, she focused on helping him build a better future. She helped him develop a plan for what he would do when he was eventually released from prison. She connected him with organizations that could provide housing, employment assistance, and ongoing counseling. Angela also helped Frank understand the importance of making amends. She encouraged him to reach out to some of the people he had hurt, to apologize, and to try to make restitution where possible. This was an incredibly difficult process. Some people refused to speak with him. Others were willing to listen but could not forgive him. But Frank persisted, understanding that the goal was not to receive forgiveness but to acknowledge the harm he had caused and to express genuine remorse. Another important ally was a journalist named Tom, who had been researching Frank's story for years. Tom was fascinated not just by the criminal aspects of Frank's life, but by his transformation while in prison. Tom helped Frank tell his story in a way that was honest and unflinching, without glorifying his criminal past or minimizing the harm he had caused. Through Tom's work, Frank's story reached newspapers, magazines, and eventually television programs. The media attention brought both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, it gave Frank a platform to speak about redemption and change. On the other hand, it also brought unwanted attention from people who wanted to exploit his notoriety or who harbored resentment toward him for his past crimes. Frank had to learn to navigate this new landscape carefully, always mindful of his safety and his reputation. Perhaps the most unexpected ally came in the form of a former rival from his criminal days. This man, who had once been Frank's enemy, had also spent time in prison and had undergone his own transformation. When they encountered each other in prison, there was initial tension and suspicion. But over time, they began to talk, to share their experiences, and to support each other in their respective journeys toward redemption. This former rival helped Frank understand that his past did not define his future, that he could choose to be a different person, and that redemption was possible even for someone who had done terrible things. The two men became unlikely friends, bound together by their shared experience of falling from grace and their mutual desire to rebuild their lives. Frank also found support in religious communities. He had never been particularly religious before his imprisonment, but in prison, he discovered the power of faith. He began attending religious services, reading spiritual texts, and developing a relationship with God. This spiritual foundation became crucial to his ability to process his guilt, to forgive himself, and to move forward with his life. The combination of these various forms of support, professional help, media attention, unexpected friendships, and spiritual growth, created a network of allies that helped Frank navigate the difficult process of redemption. He was no longer alone, and he was no longer desperate. He had found people who believed in him, who supported him, and who helped him see that his life could have meaning and purpose beyond his criminal past. Share this video with someone you know who needs to hear this message about redemption and change. Sharing helps us reach more people and spread the message that it's never too late to transform your life. Click the share button and let your network know about Frank's incredible journey. Frank Lucas was eventually released from prison after serving approximately 15 years of his sentence. His release was conditional. He was placed under strict parole supervision and had to comply with numerous restrictions. But he was free, and that freedom, though limited, represented a new beginning. The transition from prison to the outside world was not easy. The world had changed significantly during his years of incarceration. Technology had advanced, society had evolved, and the criminal underworld that he had once dominated had transformed beyond recognition. Frank had to learn to navigate this new world, to find employment, to rebuild relationships with family members who had moved on with their lives, and to establish himself as a productive member of society. One of the first challenges Frank faced was finding employment. Few employers were willing to hire someone with his criminal record and his notoriety. But through the connections he had made while in prison and the support of organizations dedicated to helping formerly incarcerated individuals, Frank eventually found work. He took jobs that were far removed from his former life of luxury. He worked as a driver, in restaurants, and in other service positions. The work was humble, but it was honest, and that was what mattered to Frank. More importantly, Frank used his freedom to continue his work toward redemption. He became a speaker, sharing his story with schools, community organizations, and youth groups. He spoke about the dangers of the drug trade, the consequences of criminal activity, and the possibility of change and redemption. His message was powerful because it came from someone who had lived it, who had experienced the heights of criminal success and the depths of imprisonment and regret. Frank also worked with law enforcement and government agencies, providing information about the drug trade and helping to educate the public about the realities of organized crime. This was a controversial decision. Some people saw it as betrayal, while others saw it as a necessary part of his redemption. Frank himself struggled with the decision, but he ultimately believed that using his knowledge to help prevent others from following the same path was the right thing to do. One of the most meaningful aspects of Frank's redemption was his work with young people in Harlem. He returned to the neighborhood where he had built his empire, but this time with a different mission. He worked with youth programs, mentoring young people who were at risk of following the same path he had taken. He shared his story, his regrets, and his hard-won wisdom. He tried to show them that there were other ways to achieve success, other ways to gain respect and power that did not involve crime and violence. Frank also worked to repair his relationships with his family. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his redemption. Some family members had testified against him, and the wounds from that betrayal ran deep. But Frank came to understand that his family members had made their own choices, just as he had made his. He worked to forgive them, to rebuild trust, and to establish new relationships based on honesty and genuine care rather than on the transactional relationships of his criminal past. As Frank aged, he became increasingly focused on his legacy. He wanted to be remembered not just as a drug lord, but as a man who had recognized his mistakes, who had worked to make amends, and who had dedicated his later years to helping others avoid the same path. He wrote a memoir, gave interviews, and participated in documentaries. He wanted his story to serve as a warning and an inspiration, a warning about the dangers of the criminal lifestyle and an inspiration that redemption is possible for anyone, no matter how far they have fallen. The betrayals that had once seemed so devastating, the informants, the family members who testified against him, the associates who cooperated with authorities, eventually came to be seen by Frank in a different light. He came to understand that these betrayals, while painful, had ultimately saved his life. They had forced him to confront his actions, to face the consequences of his choices, and to begin the long process of redemption. Frank Lucas's story is not a simple tale of good versus evil, of crime and punishment. It is a complex narrative about human nature, about the capacity for change, and about the possibility of redemption even for those who have committed terrible acts. It is a story about the importance of genuine human connection, about the dangers of isolation and loneliness, and about the power of people who are willing to help others transform their lives. In his later years, Frank became a symbol of redemption and change. He was no longer the king of Harlem, but he had found something more valuable than power or wealth. He had found purpose, meaning, and the genuine connections that make life worth living. He had learned that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from the courage to face one's past, to acknowledge one's mistakes, and to work tirelessly toward becoming a better person. The betrayals that had once destroyed him had ultimately freed him. The isolation that had once defined his existence had given way to genuine human connection. The desperate search for help that had characterized his early years in prison had led him to discover resources, allies, and ultimately, himself. Frank Lucas's journey from the king of Harlem to a man desperately seeking help, and finally to a man who had found redemption, is a testament to the human capacity for change. It is a story that reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, that it is never too late to change, and that the most powerful transformations often come from the most unexpected places. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. We're committed to bringing you the most compelling narratives about real people, real struggles, and real transformations. Join our community of viewers who believe in the power of storytelling and the possibility of change. Subscribe today and be part of our growing family.